Good morning. This morning we're going to be talking about semicolons and colons. And I have three goals for today's session. The first of those is that students will appreciate how punctuation functions to enhance written language. My second goal is that students will appreciate the function of a semicolon when it's used in a sentence. And then the third goal is that students will appreciate the function of a colon when it's used in a sentence. And I think this morning's lesson begins with a discussion of the role of punctuation. We know that written language was preceded by spoken language. And just as a writer wants to engage a reader, a speaker wanted to engage the listener. And the speaker would do that by means of their voice and by starts and stops in their voice. And they used their voice to express excitement or concern or alarm. And when the form, spoken language, moved into a written form, the punctuation signs that were developed assisted the writer so that the reader could stay engaged in the same way that the speaker kept the listener engaged. So punctuation is important because it guides the reader through the passage without losing the reader, holds the reader's attention, and simply minimizes confusion so that the reader knows what we're talking about now and who did what when, and is completely following what the writer wants the reader to do. So when we use our punctuation, we certainly know the punctuation that ends the sentence. That's very familiar to us. We know that the period is a full stop. Then the written language continues with another complete thought that then goes on to end with another pause, another period. We have another sign that we're familiar with, the question mark. And we know that the question mark indicates to the reader that there's a question here. So just as the voice would rise at the end of a spoken question, that question mark signals this isn't a fact, this is a question about whether this is a fact. And in the same way, the exclamation point is going to show emotion. It's going to show stop. Hey, it's going to express right now, pay attention, there's a heightened level of emotion connected to what's written. And we use punctuation to deliver that message. Now, we talked about signs that are at the end of the sentence. We're now, in today's lesson, going to be talking about signs that are within the sentence. And we use semicolons and colons are among those signs. And we use those signs to separate words and clauses to avoid confusion. And just as with the spoken language, if you had the run-on spoken language where you just talked about what you did today and you just walked down the road and you met Lucille and then you kept going and you went to the store and you bought a bag of groceries, that would lose your listener really quickly because it's just a run-on without any change in the sound of my voice. So in the same way, we can't have run-on sentences because it has the same effect. So we separate words and clauses even within a sentence to avoid that experience and keep the reader engaged. We use semicolons and colons to emphasize some words over other words. We want to say within our sentence, some things have power. Sometimes we're working up to a thought in our sentence. And so we use punctuation to tell the reader that we're working up to something. And then finally, there's that issue of confusion. We really want to use this internal means of controlling our written language so that the reader is not confused about what exactly we're talking about here, and moving on to the next thought. So I'm going to give you a demonstration of that. I've written, the committee chair did not recognize me when I raised my hand, semicolon. I demanded to be heard. that sentence has two independent clauses. The first independent clause has a subject and a verb, and the second independent clause has a subject and a verb. Each of those could stand alone, but it's combined with one sentence, and within that sentence is a semicolon that separates the two. And that semicolon is telling the reader that those two clauses have the same weight. They have the same power. The committee chair did not recognize me when I raised my hand. I demanded to be heard. So there's no confusion. These are both important parts of the same sentence. Contrast to that with a similar, very same information, but it's written with a dependent clause followed by an independent clause. When the committee chair did not recognize me when I raised my hand, comma, I demanded to be heard. There's a very subtle difference here, and it takes a little practice to figure out what that subtlety is. But the dependent clause was a little more tentative, and it was separated from the dependent clause, which had a little more power. And that separation point was a comma, not a semicolon. So here's a semicolon. We know that it looks like this. And a semicolon has three primary functions: to combine two closely related complete sentences which are not joined by a conjunction, to separate complete sentences that are joined by a conjunctive adverb, and to separate items in a list when commas alone would be confusing. And so I'm going to go through each of these and kind of demonstrate. The semicolon is used to combine two closely related complete sentences which are not joined by a conjunction. So look at these two sentences that I've started with. I took my umbrella, period. Daniel forgot his, period. Now, I put there that those are weak, but they are perfectly correct. Each has a subject, each has a verb, each delivers information to the reader. There's nothing wrong with them, but they're a little weak, and they're weak because they're repetitive. They're the same structure. One follows the other, and they sound alike, and they're boring. So you can use punctuation to kind of make it different and to combine them within one sentence. The next sentence, I took my umbrella, comma, and Daniel forgot his. We've put that connector word in there, that conjunction, and in this construction, the umbrella is followed by a comma because the connecting word is a conjunction. In the next example, we have used that same format of two independent clauses joined within one sentence and connected with a semicolon. I took my umbrella, semicolon. Daniel forgot his. Now, whether you use a comma and whether you use a semicolon depends again on whether you're connecting the two clauses with a conjunction or an conjunctive adverb. And at some point, maybe the teacher on this call can tell us a little better. I've amended to the end of this lesson some lists of conjunctive adverbs and conjunctions to kind of help with that. But is there a quick way, teacher Chris, for us to know the difference?
Not that I'm aware of.
Yeah.
Sadly, my experience in social studies, not English, so this is slightly outside my expertise.
Yeah, it is a it's hard. So my best insight for that is to take a look at the lists at the end of the sentence and kind of just become familiar enough with them so that you'll know whether a comma is required or a semicolon is required. Because a semicolon, as I move to the next screen, is used to separate complete sentences that are joined by a conjunctive adverb. And here we have that example. I took my umbrella, semicolon. However, there's your conjunctive adverb, comma. Daniel forgot his. Again, it's the same information, but you can see how I believe it's much more interesting writing. The however is a transitional word that brings us to Daniel's situation, and it is an easier sentence to read. It's an easier sentence when it's put in a body with other sentences. So we encourage the use of those transitional words just to make your writing more interesting. Now, in another way this semicolon is used is to separate items in a series when commas alone would be confusing. So we often write in series form, and here's an example of that. I have a long list of places I would like to visit. My list includes San Francisco, comma, California, semicolon, Chicago, comma, Illinois, semicolon, Paris, comma, France, semicolon, Toronto, comma, Canada, semicolon, and London, comma, England. Now you can hear as I read that we've got a series that's constructed of pairs. There's a city and either a state or a country that the city is part of. And so we have within this sentence pairs that are connected by semicolons, but within those pairs, we've separated the parts of those pairs by a comma. So it's a pattern, and that pattern is fairly easy to pick up when we have a series or a list that we're using. But it can become kind of complicated, as in this example. We use a semicolon to separate items in a series when commas alone would be confusing. So here's an example. I sorted through the bag that was in the back of my car. It contained water bottles, semicolon, baby wipes, semicolon, artificial flowers, comma, both paper and plastic, semicolon, books, semicolon, and pens. So what we have here again is a similar series, and we used semicolons to separate the major items in that series. But within that series, guess what? We have a subcategory. We have artificial flowers. And within artificial flowers, we have paper artificial flowers and plastic artificial flowers, so that the reader knows that paper and plastic belong to artificial flowers. We use a comma to set off that subcategory. And then when we move on to our list of major categories, we use a semicolon. So as I say, these are patterns, and sometimes they're pretty regular and you can figure them out without too much trouble. Other times you have to kind of pick them apart to figure out where the semicolon goes. And it goes among the dominant parts of your pattern, and the comma goes among the finer parts of your pattern. So now we're going to move to colon. And a colon looks like this. And colons have a lot of uses. And the first of those is to set up or draw the reader's attention to the ideas that follow. And I like to think of a colon like a kind of a drum roll, or something that says, if I were speaking it, I would say, okay, my voice would rise, and I would be saying, okay, get ready. I'm going to tell you something now. I'm going to give you a list, so get ready. Because a colon, that's what a colon does. And look at this sentence I've written. There are so many reasons to celebrate, colon. I found my car keys. The sun is shining. It is Friday. So my colon in that sentence told the reader that I'm going to give you a list now. I'm going to give it to you now. Wait. Okay, here it is. And then I listed the reasons to celebrate. In the same way, a colon separates an independent clause from a quotation. So I might be writing, Grandpa had a great saying, and then I have a colon. And that says, get ready for Grandpa's saying. Now I'm going to tell you what it is. And then I write, what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. So it introduces Grandpa's great saying. In the same way, a colon is used to separate an independent clause from a question. So I could write, please answer this question, colon. Here's my question. Get ready for it. My question is, how do I apply for this job? So these are very, very useful. Colons are very, very useful tools to, again, mimic that speech. Make sure that your reader gets ready now for what I'm going to say next. A colon is also used as to end a formal or business salutation in a letter. So if you're writing a letter of introduction for a job you're going to apply for, you're going to use a colon. You're going to say, "Dear Ms. Brown, colon, I am pleased to apply for the position of administrative assistant with your organization." Now, if you were writing a letter to your aunt, you would use a comma, "Dear Aunt Susie." But Ms. Brown, you're going to use the colon. It dignifies the salutation because it's a business letter. A colon is used between a title and a subtitle. So I'm going to tell you about my title of my book. It's Obedience Training, but get ready, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about my title. Its subtitle is How to Grow Your Puppy into a Good Dog. So once again, you've used that colon to kind of separate things and create a sense of something is coming after the colon. We also use colons a lot with numbers. The time of day, I think everybody's pretty much familiar with this, that we use the hour, colon, the minutes, 8:30 a.m. We use a colon to define scripture references. So let's turn to John 3:1-7. So we've used the colon to separate the chapter and the verses of a Bible passage. We also use a colon to express a ratio. So you've got a ratio, your ratio of water to flour should be 3:1. So in spoken word, the colon says 2, but when you're reading it, the colon is used to say 2, and it's 3:1. So when in doubt, consider the context of what you're saying. You don't need punctuation to tell what is already being stated in the body of the sentence. And it means that means that what you've done is you've chosen a word that actually incorporates what follows. So instead of saying with your colon, "Get ready, I'm going to tell you what's going to follow. I'm going to tell you what I want you to know," you have chosen a word that says that, and you don't need both. And a word, in my next sentence, I'm going to show you, my list of favorite foods includes chocolate, strawberries, and chocolate strawberries. So you've used the word includes, and that word means that what follows is already incorporated. It actually kind of takes the place of a colon, as you can see in the next sentence. These are my favorite foods: chocolate, strawberries, and chocolate strawberries. So you've constructed your sentence a little differently with a independent clause, colon, and your list. But you could use instead another word that expresses the same thing. You don't use a colon after words or expressions like such as, for example, or for instance, because it's exactly the same thing. You've already chosen words that take the place of a colon, or you've chosen a colon to take the place of these certain words. So if I were to write, I confuse words that sound alike but are spelled differently, such as red and red, high and high, so and so. I don't need a colon there because I've said such as, and it goes ahead to introduce those words that I get confused by. Instead, but I could use a colon. I confuse the words that sound alike but are spelled differently, colon, and then I give you my words. Either one is perfectly acceptable, but you just don't use both. The same thing with the verbs of being, a state of being, and that would be the verbs like the conjugations of to be, is, are, was, were, am. Those state of being verbs already express what might be followed by a colon. They were tired. You wouldn't use a colon there. You would not say they were colon tired, because the state of being verb already says that. So I have a couple of FAQs here. The first of those is, do you use a colon when only one item follows? And the reason why you might think otherwise is because we're often looking for a series or a list, and those are usually more than one. But with a colon, you can use a single word. I have one word for this day, colon, lousy. That's perfectly proper. And the second FAQ is, when is the use of a semicolon mandatory? When do you have to use it? Never. That's good news. But it's the writer's choice. And again, there are real advantages to using it. You might want to use it as your writing progresses, but it's never mandatory. It just has to be used correctly. So that, as I said, is my lesson on semicolons and colons. I hope you will grow to love them, as I do. But I've given you a couple of lists here on that very difficult problem, at least for me, of when am I using a coordinating conjunction and when am I using a conjunctive adverb, because you kind of just got to get familiar with these lists. Okay, Chris, do you have anything else?
No, I think that was really great.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Well, then I thank you all for your attention, and I will just have a good day.